The Ontario Historical Society, for those of you who aren't familiar with our group, is a non-profit corporation and registered charity, a non-government group founded in 1888, bringing together people of all ages, all walks of life, and all cultural backgrounds interested in preserving some aspect of Ontario's history. And just as a side note, 2013 was the 125th anniversary of the Ontario Historical Society and the 100th anniversary of our headquarters in Willowdale, that's in North York, John Mackenzie House. So the webinar you're about to undertake was developed as part of the Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project. Now this is a new project at the OHS which will, through several online initiatives, connect members and affiliates of the OHS and provide opportunities for interaction amongst heritage groups throughout the province. The project includes the creation of a members blog as part of a refreshed OHS website, an interactive mapping tool showing heritage organizations and sites within the OHS Heritage Directory, and of course this webinar series. The Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project is funded by the Government of Ontario's Museums and Technology Fund. Now, I just wanted to take a moment to do a quick poll of everyone here in the webinar today to get a sense of where you are. So I'm going to set up a poll, and you should be able to click and choose your region to show where you are. So you should be seeing a poll saying, where are you in Ontario? Please choose your region. And I will share it with you now, show you guys where everyone is. So now you should see where are you in Ontario results. It looks like we've got folks from all over the province, some from Central Ontario, Eastern, a lot in the Greater Toronto area, a bunch from the North, and some Southwestern Ontario. So thank you everyone for joining us around the province. So our webinar today will start very shortly. The presentation will last for about 40 minutes and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. You're welcome to submit questions throughout the webinar and I'll collect them and read them to our Q&A panel in the latter half of our session. Just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to OHS members and eventually the public for viewing. We'll be also sending a copy of today's slides to everyone, so you don't need to write down frantically. You'll get them tomorrow. We'll be sending the slides and a PDF of grant writing resources and guides, along with a follow-up evaluation survey. And it really does help us if you fill out the survey, so we please ask that you do. A bit about our speakers. We have a number of speakers today, the most we've ever had in a single webinar. So here's a quick look at each of today's contributors. First up is Kate Oxley, and she's a Heritage Outreach Consultant from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. And then we have Kathy Leakham, who is the Program Manager for the Multicultural History Society of Ontario. Kathy has a master's degree in History and Museum Studies from University College London and the University of Toronto iSchool, and she's contributed as a Heritage Consultant to cultural management projects in Ontario and further afield. Since joining the MHSO in 2012, Kathy has managed projects funded through the Ontario Trillium Foundation, Young Canada Works, and Grants Ontario's Summer Experience Program, Museums and Technology Fund, and Provincial Heritage Organization Grant. Our next speaker, Ryan Frigo, works as the Help Desk Lead for the Grants Ontario system, and he'll be taking us through the ins and outs of applying using the Grants Ontario application tool. And finally, we have Angelina French, who is a Program Assistant with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. And she's been in the Ontario Public Service since 1990 and involved directly in grants administration since 1995. Angelina has been specifically attached to the HODG and CMOG grant programs since 1996 till present, with very brief periods of secondment to other ministry grant programs. Just a few notes about using this webinar software and how we are going to ask questions today. A few things to go over. In order to ask a question, you just type a question in the space provided below question in your menu bar. If you can't see the question space, you may need to expand the questions section by clicking on it. You'll see a space with type a question for staff. That's where you write. I'll be going over the questions during the webinar. If there's a very common question that arises, I'll pass it on to our speaker right away, but otherwise I'll hold them until the Q&A portion. If you run into trouble during the webinar and you need my help, you can use the raised hand button. It's a small yellow hand next to your menu. Just click it and a little hand will be raised next to your name, and I'll chat with you privately to see what I can do to help. Now, if you're finding that the slides are moving slowly or your audio keeps cutting out, try closing a few other programs. The more bandwidth you're using, the harder the webinar program has to work. If you lose your connection, try closing the webinar window and then re-entering the room using the link you received in your confirmation email today. Closing and restarting usually solves the problem. Our first speaker will be Kate Oxley, so I'm going to pass control to her. Kate, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the funding programs currently offered by the ministry, although I must hasten to add I'm only in charge of one of the programs. So while I don't claim to be an expert on all of them, I can at least present at least your options. The screen you see in front of you now is the list of programs for our ministry that is available on the Grants Ontario website. So there are 14 programs in all, covering everything from libraries to sport. So it's a pretty broad range of programs. What I'll be focusing on today are the programs offered by culture divisions. So there's a tourism division, a culture division, and a sport division. And I'll be talking specifically about culture division today. At the moment, if you want to know what your opportunities are within the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, and Sport, specifically related to culture, we only have one project fund right now. And it's the culture development. It's a combination of several of the earlier funds that we used to have, things like museum and technology, things like cultural strategic initiatives fund, that kind of thing. The groups that can apply are quite broad. So if you're a not-for-profit organization, you're an eligible applicant. And it's focused on sort of the real nugget of what makes organizations strong, and that's leadership. So I think the people who developed this fund thought to themselves, if there were only one thing that we could do to make the sector stronger, it would be to work on leadership. And that's what that focus is for that program. And it's a 50-50 matching program, so you have to come up with half of the funds. The 2013 announcements went out earlier, I would say earlier in March, I think. So they've just come out within the last several weeks. And we don't have a deadline for 2014, but I understand that it will be announced in the new year once the new budget has come down. If you want to know more about this program, you can talk to people you probably already know, which are your regional service advisors. So there are advisors who work with our ministry in regions all over the province of Ontario. And Allison can put you in touch with those people if you don't know who they are, but I suspect that most of you have already actually had some interaction with these people because they do a really broad range of community organizing within their particular communities. The other thing I wanted to touch on today, I was asked to talk about evaluation. I'm going to give you some of what I have learned over years of being both on the applicant side of the table and the recipient side, or the applicant side of the table and the funder side of the table. So they're more general principles than specific information about any particular grant. These are things that would hold true no matter what grant you're applying for. And the key, I would say, as you can see, is that it's not a secret. You don't have to wonder what they're looking for because they're going to tell you, and they want you, every funder wants you to succeed in making your application. So read the guidelines in the application. I know you've heard people say that before, but it really is true that if you don't spend time really figuring out what the guidelines say and what they're looking for, then you're not going to make a good application. The next point that I encourage people to do is to think about the way they're viewing the donor a little bit differently than perhaps they have in the past. I would say the Achilles heel of most grant applicants is that they view their donor as someone who just wants to do something good. And in some cases that's true, but for the most part, the fact that you're a good thing isn't enough of a reason to fund. So what I say is think about the funder as an investor and think about what you're going to do for them. You have to express not just what your need is and not just what the solution to that need looks like, but how the world's going to be different once you've done it. So you've solved that issue, and then what's different at that point once you've gone through that project and you've solved that issue, because that end outcome is what the investor is buying. It's always hard to know how much information to put in. Sometimes you get a word or a word count or a length guide, and that's a pretty good clue to what they're looking for. As someone who's read a lot of applications, I can tell you that it's tiring to read an application, and it's a lot of work if you're a grant reviewer, and you may have dozens and dozens of applications to read. You have to kind of hedge your bets, and the way that I suggest people do that is by using appendices. You want to craft a compelling story that would appeal to the average taxpayer, I think anyone should be able to read your grant and understand that you've made a compelling case for what it is you are asking for, and that person would say, yeah, I think my tax dollars should go to that. So that's a little test. If you can get someone who's a non-expert to read your grant and say, yeah, I would put money on that, I would appreciate my government investing in that, then you know you've hit the right note. And then depending on what the topic is that you're applying for, you may need more layers of information. And of course, if you're applying for a highly complex grant, like a SHIRT grant or something like that, then obviously you're talking about a whole other ballgame. You do have to address those expert questions in those cases, and that's where you can refer to more dense information in appendices. And that way the average reader can get through it quickly, and people with further questions know where to go. The transition that happens after the grant is over is another thing I wanted to point out. The Ontario Trillium Foundation, they're great funders, and they're great at creating an application process which even beginners have to think through to explain a lot of these key points that I'm talking about today. And one of the things they really focus on is what happens after the grant is over. So they can give up to 3-year funding, and then after those 3 years, that's it. And they don't want to create a white elephant. They don't want to create something that got a great initiative started and then it died because the funding was over. So I think that focusing on how you're going to move forward at the end of the grant is really essential, and it's a kind of business planning that needs to take place so that you identify revenue streams adequate to carry on that activity. So focus on that. That's a really key point. No one likes to receive a grant application that asks for something when they've just funded a similar project for somebody else. It's really vital that you do an environmental scan at the beginning of your application to know who are the other players in this field. If I want to change the world in this particular area, who else is doing it? Maybe it's somebody you weren't expecting. The extent to which you can build innovative partnerships with other groups who have a shared interest in what you're doing and can help you deliver your outcomes, the better. And finally, visuals and graphs make it easy to read. It's a picture really can say 1,000 words, and people are looking for simple, high-impact punches of information. So I encourage you to do that. Finally, in preparation for this webinar, Allison let me know that people were interested in knowing what priorities and current trends were, so I wanted to touch on that a little bit. As I mentioned, we only have one project grant, and its focus is on strengthening leadership. So that means things such as the 3 items I've got listed here. It's about thinking through your path to move forward, and it's about getting your basic ingredients in place related to your staff and your board to make sure you can carry out your mission. In terms of the operating grant that I'm involved with, there are several things that interest me particularly, and the thing that struck me was when I sat down to think about what it was that I've really been interested in lately, it echoes the 3 points that I stated previously in relationship to CDF. So it's about governance and management, and specifically the element within that area that interests me right now is the development of next-gen and young professionals groups. So several of my clients have started this trend, and they have a special membership category, and they have special committees, and they have their own meetings, and they do their own projects, and it's absolutely fantastic. In terms of the strategic planning element, the thing that we're looking for so much right now is relevance. It comes back to some of the points I made earlier about who do you matter to? If you disappear tomorrow, who would care? You have to think that through, and it's also about, again, attracting a new generation of participants. So what was relevant to the baby boomer generation might not be relevant to Gen Y, but you've got to find a way to bridge that gap because you need that young energy to come into your organization. That part of the board's job in doing their strategic plan is to think about how they deliver their mission to those new audiences. And then finally, the last thing that I'm getting very excited about right now is social enterprise. And obviously that's something you could do a whole webinar on in and of itself, but it's looking at the creation of a business model that provides long-term support for your organization through the sale of some kind of good or service, which is not necessarily the raison d'etre of the organization itself. It delivers that raison d'etre. So the example might be something where it's like, for example, a catering organization, a catering company that employs people with particular challenges, teaches them how to cook, teaches them how to deliver catering experience to clients, and in the process they're training, they're doing job training, they're creating attachments to the labor force, they're integrating newcomers, etc. So these are examples where the catering example in this case funds those bigger goals, which are really the point of the organization. It's an exciting way to think about doing business differently. And that's just one example, but there are many examples out there now of very innovative business planning strategies. So those are some of the current trends that I'm interested in right now. So that's it from me, and I look forward to coming back at the Q&A for further questions. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kate. I'm going to take control back from you and pass it on to Ryan Frigo, who is going to take us through the process of applying for Grants Ontario. And after that, we'll have a brief Q&A with just Ryan. There you are. Ryan, can you hear us?
Yep.
Great. Hello. Welcome.
All right, gang. My name is Ryan Frigo. I work with the Grants Ontario Customer Service Desk, and I'll be eager to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. What I'll be taking you through here today is how to get access to the Grants Ontario system, so the registration process, and kind of a brief overview of what it's like once you get in. The first step is to enter the website at the top of the slide there, grants.govanka, into your web browser. Now, we prefer that you use Internet Explorer. You can use Chrome and Firefox. However, in the past, we've had some difficulties with how they interface with the site. We know that Internet Explorer 8 and above work best. Some versions of Firefox, particularly the older ones, are a little bit buggy. And we've had some issues with Chrome in the past, but for the most part, we've overcome those. The big problem with Chrome is there's a built-in PDF viewer that you have to disable. So we really prefer that you use Internet Explorer just to avoid any issues. That being said, should you run into any, you can always contact us and we can walk you through. So after you've chosen your language, in this case we chose English, you're at the main portal page. And as you can see, circled on the top right there is a login button. So after you review all the information here and you're ready to actually get started, you'll click that login button. The next page that comes up is a splash page that indicates all the different technology requirements that we suggest that you have enabled prior to beginning your registration process. So take some time to review that. As I mentioned earlier, you'll need a working version of Adobe, and that we support Internet Explorer. Once you've reviewed all those terms, just click here to continue, which is circled at the bottom there. And the next thing you'll see is that you're transported to the OneKey login screen. Now, OneKey is administered by Service Ontario, and the Grants Ontario system is housed behind OneKey. So it's very important to remember that distinction, that Grants Ontario is behind a barrier called OneKey. OneKey offers a whole variety of services. You can get your license renewed, you can get a hunting license, you can get some vital information, you know, like birth certificate, marriage certificate, that kind of thing, along with other sites. I think OSAP is even behind here as well. So when we're talking about the registration process, it's important to remember that it's a two-step process. The first step is to develop a OneKey ID, and this is something that you create yourself. Then once you've got a OneKey account, you can then register for Grants Ontario. So if you already have a OneKey account and you've already registered for Grants Ontario, you don't need to re-register. You just need to sign in to Grants Ontario using your OneKey account on this page. Your OneKey account does not expire, but the Grants Ontario system ID and PIN expire after 30 days of being issued. So this is what you get after you do the registration. This will all become clear in the subsequent slides. So if you use the system in the last year, then you don't need to know your Grants Ontario and PIN. You just sign in with your OneKey ID and password. So we're going to assume here that you don't have a OneKey account, and we're going to click the Sign Up Now button, or Sign Up Now link that's circled in red. And we're going to go through the creation of a OneKey ID process. So it's at this point that you have to create your own OneKey ID and password. This is not something that anybody here on the help desk can provide you. This is something that you need to create for yourself. So you'll create your ID and password, and then we advise that you select and answer 3 password recovery questions. So it could be anything like, what's my cat's name, where did I go to high school, mother's maiden name, that type of thing. This is really important in case you don't use Grants Ontario very often, or you don't use OneKey very often, and you want to be able to recover your password or your user ID. This is managed by Service Ontario. So if you call us and ask for help recovering your OneKey ID or password, the first thing we're going to say is, did you make any recovery questions? Because that's the only way that you're going to be able to retrieve that information, as we don't have access to it. We're going to assume here that we've created our ID and password, we've put in our recovery questions, and then we're going to click the Sign Up button that's circled at the bottom right. You'll then see a confirmation page. So when you entered an email address on the previous screen, you'll receive an email confirmation with your account ID. This one, for purposes of this demonstration, is Laura Jamer 111. You then click the Continue button. Oh, there's one more thing I want to bring to your attention. Notice that at the bottom of that message, it says, need more assistance, please call Service Ontario, and the 2 numbers there. So just another reminder that any problems that you experience with OneKey, your best bet is to call Service Ontario. Any problems you experience with the Grants Ontario system, by all means give us a ring. So now that you've clicked on Continue, you'll see all the services currently available in OneKey. And you'll notice that Grants Ontario is just one of the services available to citizens who have a OneKey account. This is another reason why it's important that each user of Grants Ontario create their own OneKey and create their own account with Grants Ontario. Because if you're sharing somebody's OneKey, they might want to use that OneKey to do, well, to get vital statistics applications, put in an OSAP request, anything like that. And you don't want to be using that account shared amongst all of your employees just because they might be using it for sensitive personal stuff. So we really do advise that for each user in your organization, you create a separate OneKey account and create a separate account with Grants Ontario. You'll all be under the same organization, but this way you'll have your own way of getting access to Grants Ontario. As I said, Grants Ontario is just one of the services for which you can enroll, and we've got it circled there in the left column. So we're going to click on that, and now we're taken to a page that asks us to enroll for the Grants Ontario system. So you notice that the page is divided in half. The top half is where we would request our enrollment number, and the bottom half is if we already registered and we got that enrollment number, and that little box is where we put it in. So since we're new to the system, we're going to request enrollment number. So you just click on that link, and the next page that loads is your typical registration form, except everything with an asterisk here, a little red asterisk, are mandatory. So fill out all this information, and then click Next at the bottom. The next screen that comes up is your standard terms and conditions. Do you agree that do you agree with the terms and conditions here and the security and privacy messaging that we've provided? Provided you agree, click I agree. The next thing you do is just a confirmation page. The next thing you see is a confirmation page just saying you've completed your registration. Click Finish to complete it. And then you will see another message telling you to wait for registration approval. So once you complete your registration, it comes to our office, and we review the content of that registration, and if there's a problem with it, or maybe there's missing information, or a spelling mistake in a name, or there's something that makes us curious, we will get in touch with you, either by phone or email. Typically we follow up by phone just to verify that you are who you say you are, you belong with this organization, and that you did intend to register for Grants Ontario. So it's just a step that we do to make sure that the people in the system are legit and that they should be there. So now you've completed the registration, and we can just click the back to one key or close the web browser window to log out. So within 24 hours of us approving the registration, and we can take up to 5 days to approve the registration, within 24 hours of our approval, you'll receive 2 emails from Grants Ontario. The first will be your enrollment ID, and the second will be your PIN. Now the enrollment ID is, I think, a 6-digit string of numbers preceded by the letters EGMS. So it'll be EGMS 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or something like that. And your PIN is a 4-digit PIN that you'll be using to enter into your registration confirmation or enrollment confirmation that I showed you earlier. If you don't receive them, don't register for another enrollment number. Just remember to check your junk mail, and if they're not there, so check your junk mail and your spam, because sometimes do not reply addresses, like the one that sends out our PIN and ID, gets filtered. So just check there, and if they're not, contact us by phone or send us an email and just ask what's the status of your registration, and somebody here can track that down for you. Worth mentioning that our hours are Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 5. So now we're going to assume that we've received the 2 emails from Grants Ontario with your enrollment ID and password, and now we're going to log back into OneKey. So remember, we go to grants.govanka, we hit login, we click that little click here to continue button, then it takes us to the OneKey login page. We put in the OneKey ID and password that we created, and that takes us to this page that we're seeing here now. So once again, we're going to click on Grants Ontario System. On the first time, remember we went up to the enrollment for Grants Ontario System? Well, this time we're going to go to the bottom half of the screen, and we're going to enter in the enrollment number that was sent to us via email. So we're going to type that number into the box and then click Submit. And the next page that loads will ask for the PIN. So we'll enter that information that came in a second email and then click Submit. Another Terms and Conditions page appears. We'd ask that you review the information and click I agree if you, of course, agree. So now, that's it. You're now registered, and your OneKey ID is now associated with your profile on Grants Ontario. So now when you go to My Services over here, when you click on that, the Grants Ontario system appears as a link below. So now you will only need your OneKey ID and password to log in from now on, and you can discard the 2 emails that were sent with your Grants Ontario enrollment ID and password. Should you wish to register for more services, you can just click that All Services from A to Z button down here. But for our purposes, we're just going to carry on with the Grants Ontario system. Clicking on Grants Ontario system will bring you to the site itself. So now you're in Grants Ontario, you can apply for grants, review your organization's applications, or submit interim or final reports. And this is the page, this is kind of the landing page when you first get into Grants Ontario. As you can see, there's a lot of information here. So for more details on how to use Grants Ontario, please refer to the reference guide for applicants, which can be seen after clicking the Grants Ontario help link found at grants.govanka. So everything about how to get around the system once you've registered is contained right here in this helpful link. The registration guide, which is just above it, covers off the process that I've just described. Of course, all of our contact information is also listed below. And that's the end of my presentation. I'd be more than happy to take any questions that may have come up over the course of my presentation, or if you've got any comments or any other concerns that you may have experienced while trying to register.
Great, thanks Ryan. Just a quick note, I did put this in the chat, but we've put links to both the registration guide and the reference guide in the PDF that we'll be sending out to everyone tomorrow. So they'll be able to look for it themselves, or they can wait for the PDF. So you'll have that tomorrow in your inbox. I did get a few people asking a very similar question. A few people wanted to know, can they set up a generic one-key account for their organization, or must it be linked to an individual?
Okay, there's nothing stopping you from making a generic account for your organization, except for the pitfalls that I've outlined earlier. So if you create it under your name and you leave the company, and you want to use that one key again to apply for a birth certificate or apply for a son or daughter's OSAP, you'd have to create another one key for yourself, or get the others at your old work or disassociate themselves from that account. So as I said, there's nothing preventing you from doing so. It's just not considered a best practice because you're sharing information that could be private. So if you're committed to just having one shared one-key account, you could do so, but you just have to be aware that that one key shouldn't be associated with a single person. So it's not advisable, but there's nothing stopping you from doing it. I'm sure that's probably caused more confusion than I intended, but does that make sense, or would you like to get into more specifics about how one key works?
I think that works. From my understanding, it's better if you maintain an individual account than an organizational account. But I've just gotten one question that I wanted to pass on to you, but then we'll move on to the next speaker. This question says, if I create a one-key account for myself and use it at an organization and then leave the organization, can that organization still access the grant application under someone else's one key?
Oh, yes, certainly. So how the registration process works is that we're making an assumption that the person with the one key is also going to be our contact person in Grants Ontario. So if I was to create a one key and then register for Grants Ontario, and my colleague was to do the same, when I left, my colleague could still go in with theirs and access everything that I had done in the Grants Ontario system for that organization. Likewise, if I create a one key and register for Grants Ontario and leave the organization, all I have to do is just leave that one key ID and password information with the organization or with the colleague that's taking over, and they can still get access to Grants Ontario. However, their presence in Grants Ontario will have the name of the person who originally created it. So, for instance, if I went in and registered, then it would say, "Welcome back, Ryan Frigo." However, if I leave the company and pass it over to Allison, when she logs in, it's still going to say, "Welcome, Ryan Frigo," because it's my user ID and my contact information. Now, I could ask Grants Ontario, if I was Allison, she could ask Grants Ontario to change this information around so that it says, "Welcome back, Allison Little." But chances are we at the help desk would encourage Allison to create her own one key, just in case Ryan should ever come back.
All right, thank you, Ryan. So I'm going to take control back from you and pass it over to Kathy Leacom from the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, who is going to speak with us about her experiences applying for grant funding through Grants Ontario. Kathy, are you there? Can you hear us?
I am. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So I'm going to start by giving a quick introduction to the Multicultural History Society, and then we'll get into this next section of the webinar here. The MHSO is a not-for-profit organization located here in Toronto. We're a provincial heritage organization, and we've received funding through Grants Ontario Summer Experience Program for the last few years. And we're in the process of completing a project that's been funded through the Museums and Technology Fund, which has now been incorporated into the new Culture Development Fund, as Kate described. I'd like to take the time during this part of the session to discuss 4 key points that I found very important to remember when considering and preparing applications for Grants Ontario. And I'm also going to take a really short bit of time at the end to discuss a few tips for the reporting process when you're reporting on your project once you've received your funding. And this is intended to represent an applicant's perspective. And it's hopefully going to be useful to anyone who's new to the Grants Ontario system, but also to anybody who's new to application writing and report writing in general. And so this is kind of me pulling out ideas that I think would have been very helpful for me to know when I first started this kind of work. So the first thing to remember when you're considering application is to consider your eligibility for the funding program that you're thinking about. And Kate mentioned, I think most people will be looking at the Culture Development Fund program. But whatever program you're looking at, you want to ensure that your organization fits the funding program and that the goals and nature of your project match the objectives of the program that you're considering. The Grants Ontario website is a really useful first stop when you're starting to review your options. And we already had a look at this, but I want to come back to it really quickly. All of the grants are listed here, and each grant has a page which provides details on the priorities for the program, funding, and also eligibility. So it's a good first stop to see whether your project and your organization fit the program, because you don't want to go through the effort of applying, obviously, if you're not eligible. There's also program guidelines available, which provide more details on eligibility and instructions for filling out the application, as well as sample applications, which have been very useful for me, and also examples of successful projects. And these are good to review because you can compare them to your project and see what kind of a fit you might be. So once you've had a chance to look at the site and application guidelines and successful grants, it's really helpful to speak to a regional advisor. And I'm going to be coming back to this point throughout my section of the webinar here. Regional advisors are a great resource throughout your project because they can quickly clarify any questions or problems you might be having with the application or reporting process, or any other issues that might come up with the project. I know that Kate Oxley, I pestered Kate quite a bit, many times, since I first started with the MHSO, and she's always been very patient with my questions, no matter how complex or arcane they might be. So please do feel free to reach out to them. And besides regional advisors, it's also a good idea to get in touch with other funded organizations. And I think a few people who are attending this webinar had a few questions about that. Certainly get in touch with any contacts you might have who have experience writing applications for Grants Ontario, because they can provide you with feedback on whether your project is eligible and also help you with actually preparing the application if you're comfortable sharing that part of the process with them. So besides eligibility, I would say project planning for me is the most important part of application writing. It's really useful to incorporate your project planning into the application process for many reasons. It's going to benefit your project and make your application that much stronger. And most importantly, it's going to save you a huge amount of time and headache in the long run if you fit your project plan to the expectations of the application and the funding program. You want to start early and give yourself plenty of time for planning. The more detailed you can be in your project plan before and during the application writing, the better. It's great if you can finalize your ideal plan before you select a funding program and prepare the application, because you then have a very clear idea of your objectives and resources. For example, the budget and the time that will be required to complete your project. And that will help you decide which funding program is right for you. You can also use the application itself as a planning tool. The applications are usually structured with project planning in mind. And I've included the CDF guidelines here as an example. So these are the culture guidelines. And this is the appendix of the guidelines, which include instructions for filling out the application. And you'll see that the application includes questions about your project work plan and your project's financial information and performance metrics. Not all of the applications are this detailed, but it's very useful to make the time to go through these exercises, no matter which application you're filling out, to ensure that you've worked out your project's feasibility and the steps that you need to get everything done. And also to keep it sustainable afterwards. You obviously want to make sure that you're not leaving it at the end of funding. You want to think about the sustainability after your funding is complete. Project planning is also very helpful because it helps to ensure that your objectives match the grant requirements, and it can alert you to any problems with the feasibility of your project. and whether it's a good or bad fit with the funding program. If you find you're struggling to make your project fit the guidelines, or having to make significant changes to the original scope and schedule, you may need to rethink whether you've picked the right program. You want to beware of because it's there. You don't want to get so wrapped up in securing funding because you're very excited about an idea for a project that you lose sight of your original goals and objectives. So it's your standard cost-benefit analysis. You want to make sure your benefits justify the costs of time and effort preparing the application and everything that will be required of you if you enter into a funding agreement. So think it through and look before you leap. Another important point once you've started drafting your application is, as Kate has mentioned during her part of the presentation, remember who your audience is and remember who you're writing for. Certainly the taxpayers are an important point. I think that's a really helpful tip when you're writing. But the reviewers obviously are someone else, are other readers that you want to keep in mind. Follow the application guidelines. I recommend printing out the application guidelines and keeping a dog-eared copy on your desk so you can refer back to it. You want to take note of grant program objectives and assessment criteria. And we're a bit short on time, so I'm not going to go into it. But you'll see that the SEP guidelines have a very useful list of criteria and also outline the assessment process for the application on page 11 of the guidelines. So you want to identify the need for your project and the benefits that will result, and not the benefits for your organization necessarily, although you can refer to that, but it's much more important that you focus on the benefits that will result for your audience and how they will tie into the funding program objectives and the ministry's wider vision. You want to be as clear and concise and to the point as possible. Reviewers read any number of applications, and I'm sure they all start to blend together after a certain point. So you want to make their job as easy as possible. Pull out those keywords in the criteria and refer to those explicitly when you're talking about how you will be addressing, how your project will be addressing program objectives. Make it so that the reviewers can read through your application very quickly and identify and even check off exactly where you address each criteria that you're supposed to address. Finally, for the application process, internal review is very helpful before you submit the application. You certainly want to recruit members of your project team and other colleagues to review the application. Members of your project team will obviously have opinions on whether the project is feasible and what needs to be included in each of your steps in your project plan. And again, it's a great time to invite experienced contacts from outside organizations in to provide feedback. And once again, contacting a regional advisor is a great idea if you have any questions about the application that you can't answer from reading the guidelines. So finishing up, I wanted to say a few quick words about reporting. The application is only the beginning. Obviously the report, once you've received funding, is just as important. It's a good idea to start your report as soon as you sign your agreement. You want to request or locate a copy of the reporting template, and you can contact Grants Ontario for those templates. They're available pretty much any time, I believe. And if you can't receive a template for the current year, you can always look at a template from previous years. Again, you want to start early. This is a golden rule, and it's easy to say, but it's so helpful to give yourself a lot of time to work on these things because they always take more time than you think. It's extremely helpful as well to draft regular internal updates and to document every stage of your project. This is especially true for multi-year projects and for projects where many people are working, are contributing to the project, so that you can keep a record of all of your accomplishments and everything that everyone has achieved. You want to, again, refer back to the language used in the guidelines and in your application. That's for your own benefit to keep the report simple and concise, and also to help out the regional advisors who are reading through any number of reports. You want to make their job as easy as possible so that they can look at your report and see very clearly what you've accomplished and how you've achieved what you said you were going to achieve. So keep in touch with your regional advisor. I guess that's my second golden rule after start early. And if you have any, if you encounter any challenges during your project, don't be afraid to contact them. They are there to help you get back on track if you do encounter challenges. So they should really be your first point of call once your project is underway. So that's it for me. Good luck on your applications, and please feel free to contact me if you have any follow-up questions. Thanks very much.
And I'm just going to unmute Kate and Angelina, who are joining us for the Q&A portion of our webinar. Kate and Angelina, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, that's Angelina French. And Kate, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. We had our registrants submit questions when they registered, so I've got a few to pass on to you. But if there's any questions you guys, those of you who are watching this webinar, have for our two panelists about anything we've talked about today or anything that comes up, please feel free to submit them using the chat tool or the question tool. So Angelina, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, because we heard from Kate about what she is seeing with the PHO grants and trends and what she's looking for, but would you be able to talk a bit about what you're seeing with the HODG program and what you're looking for from applications this year?
Well, what we're looking for and what we've seen over the years is they sort of are involved in the same sort of work, seminars and fundraisings and publication of their newsletters. And it also we've noticed that the boards don't change very often, the board members. So what we would be looking for going forward is, and we've been discussing this as well, and there's a review going on also of the program, that there should be some succession planning in there, and we should also be seeing some diversity in their activities.
Great, thank you. That's really good feedback. Can you give any examples of interesting HODG or even other HODG projects, or Kate, if you want to jump in with any of the interesting projects you've seen come through in the last couple of years that would be a great sort of benchmark for everyone listening in today?
Okay, for HODG, well, it's not really, I can't really pinpoint any project because it's not really project-based, it's an operating grant. Mm-hmm. So we really don't get much chance to look at projects. It's what we see is the organization's annual activities. That's what we see. It's really difficult to pinpoint any projects where the HODG grant is concerned.
Of course, thank you for that clarification. So just to clarify, Angelina, can you tell us what HODG stands for?
HODG stands for Heritage Organization Development Grant.
Thank you very much. Now, another question that's just come through in our question tool is, Angelina or Kate, can you provide any feedback on the idea of hiring someone to write grants for an organization? What are the pros and cons of this method as you see it?
It's Kate here. I'll answer that question, then I might even go back to the previous question. So hiring someone, it can work. I think you have to be, very careful about it, obviously. And it's not the starting place for a small organization. I mean, I think an organization needs to be at a certain level of capacity before it's able to find the funds to be able to do something like that. I do think that that's the kind of thing that from time to time the Ontario Trillium Foundation might support, because it is potentially a time-limited thing. So it's not something it's not necessarily a staff position you need to have on staff for the foreseeable future. It could be a project or an initiative that has a beginning and an end to it. So getting funding from Trillium to support the improvement of grant writing within your organization, and that might include for a period of time bringing somebody in on contract who will then later leave the organization, but hopefully will have improved the skills of your own board and or volunteers and or staff to carry on. So I think that kind of an approach can work. But as I say, it depends on whether you've got, you've got to have a certain capacity to begin with. To answer the question about, you asked a question earlier about what kind of innovative initiatives we've been seeing. I just wanted to flag one project that I think was really exciting, and it was done by one of the provincial heritage organizations, the Ontario Genealogical Society. And they got funding, and again, it was from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, multi-year grant to do a digitization project. And I think they got some money from the Museum and Technology Fund as well to do this. And it involved working with small local archives and historical societies all over the province of Ontario. And they would partner with them to get genealogically relevant documents up on the Ontario Genealogical Society website. And it would reside in a pay-per-view section. And every time it was viewed, a small amount of money would go to the OGS, and a small amount of money would go back to the original historical society or archive who provided that content. So the exciting part of this was it was an ongoing revenue creation project that did a couple of exciting things. One thing it did was it kept these documents under local control and under Canadian copyright, because otherwise what happens is large American genealogical groups and companies like Ancestry.com would have come in and bought the copyright to those documents. The second thing that it did was it created an ongoing revenue stream for multiple organizations. So it was the kind of thing that you can say, okay, at the end of the day, I know this is going to keep going even after the grant is over, because there's going to be an income stream created. And it might just be a break-even proposition. I don't think anybody's getting rich off this, but it's sustainable. So that was a really exciting project.
Thanks, Kate. That sounds really cool. I've just got a question that's come through, and it says, we're a small society that needs help to manage it. My situation has changed in the past year, and I cannot afford to put as much time into it as I have in the past. At the risk of sounding mercenary, are there any grants that would support myself and helpers to get the society going strong and getting organized? And I know this is something a lot of our members and affiliates are facing with high turnover of boards, or just the aging population of their membership, and keeping the organization going strong and kind of regrouping after maybe a period of disorganization. Is there any program that you would recommend for that kind of work?
I'm not really sure. The Heritage Organization Development Grant is a fund that helps developing organizations. But if the organization is already developed and is just trying to get through transition to a new board or sort of breathe new life into it, I'm not sure where I could point you to, really.
I'll tell you where I would start.
Okay.
I would start back at that question about if this group disappeared tomorrow, who would care? And by asking that question, you identify who your core supporters are. Who has a stake in your game? And those are the people and the organizations that you want to start working with in answering this question. So it's not as simple as one grant application. It's a whole change in thinking about why are we here. So I think the first starting point would be to sit down and revisit why you exist as an organization and what you think your organization is going to look like 5 to 10 years from now, and what it would take to get there. Only when you've thought those things through about who you matter to, why you exist, and where you're going, only then will you be able to sit down and say, okay, who wants to fund what I'm talking about here? So there isn't one answer to that question. I think there could be private foundations that exist in Canada and in Ontario that have an interest in things like that. I think that, again, the Trillium Foundation is a seminal source for that kind of developmental work. Possibly the Culture Development Fund, if you're talking about a real evolution of leadership in a project grant format that has a clear beginning, end, and a deliverable that can be conducted over 1 to 2 years. Possibly CDF is an option. You really do have to think through those 3 key questions of why you exist, who cares about you, and where you're headed before you can answer the question of what grant program would be right for you.
Great. Thank you, Kate and Angelina. We've got a few questions that have come through, so I'm going to try to get through them in the next few minutes, and thank you for everyone to stick with us. I know we're a little over time. The next question is, how do you avoid duplication from previous projects funded by other nonprofits that carried out the same capitalization project on a historical building? Would the regional advisor tell us what monies have already been spent on a particular part of the building? If either of you are able to answer this, please go ahead. It wasn't too specific, person.
I think it's a little bit of a tricky question. I think certainly if they happen to have that knowledge, I would imagine they'd be happy to share it. But that being said, I don't think they would keep an inventory of that kind of work. There are organizations such as Artsbill, which focuses particularly on the performing arts sector, that do inventories of arts facilities. So one thing you might want to find out is whether there is an organization serving your sector that might have something like that. So would the Ontario Museum Association have information like that? Would the Ontario Historical Society have information like that? Would the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario have something like that? So I would contact these umbrella groups as a way of getting that conversation started, and that's a way that you can get put into touch with other people in your community who might be doing similar things.
Great, thank you. Next question, are there any grants to fund or help an organization to find a location to house the organization?
That's a tricky one,
Mm-hmm.
because finding a place means it's sort of like capital, and we don't really fund anything of a capital nature. So I'm not really sure. Kate, what do you think?
I don't think you'd get I'm not even sure I completely understand the question. To find a location?
I think this is a group that does not have a permanent home, and they're looking to find a location to house the organization and operate out of.
So are they're looking for rent money?
Either that, it wasn't specified, but either that or funds to purchase one or the other. But yeah, basically a housing fund.
So this again is an interesting point. I mean, the difference between a project fund and an operating grant fund is that a project fund tends to fund very particular activities, products, and deliverable outcomes, whereas an operating grant can be a little bit more wide-ranging in terms of what it will support. And an operating grant can support things like your hydro bill that aren't very sexy for a project grant funder. So I would say if you have an opportunity to take advantage of an operating grant fund like HODG or like CMOG, then you would be looking at a core chunk of funding that can support things like your overhead. And that sounds like the kind of cost you're looking to have covered. If that's not an option for you, or if you're already doing that and it's not sufficient, then I think you need to take a really hard look at what you're doing, because I don't think any project grant is going to adequately address that issue for you. So I think you have to sit down and look at some kind of creative solution, either a donation in kind or something like that, or partnering with an organization that may have space available for you, or working with someone in your local downtown who has a vacant space and it's not looking very good in the downtown. Maybe they would allow you to use that space and keep it alive and keep it viable below market rent. It really will take some creativity on the part of your board to identify where that support can be found, because as I say, I don't think grant funding is a solution to that kind of ongoing problem.
Well said. Thanks, Kate. We've had a submission. Can either speaker provide information or insights on applying for the Community Museums of Ontario grant? And I believe they're referring to CMOG. So if either of you are able to give us any insights on, or top 2 or 3 things to remember when you're applying for a CMOG grant, that would be very helpful.
Yes. Okay, I can answer that. When applying for a CMOG grant, actually you got to meet the standards that are in place. There are 10 standards that every museum has to meet, and if you pass those standards, then you can enter the program. So your first step would be to send a letter of intent to the ministry saying that you would like to enter the program. And you have to have a collection, and you have to have an organization that has been in operation for at least a year and is incorporated in Ontario. So those are the criteria. So if you pass those, and we do have museum advisors here on staff who are there to help you with any question that may arise, or any of the standards that are not being met, maybe they can help you along it to getting there. But you have to meet those 10 standards that are in place in order to enter the program.
Great. Thank you very much, Angelina. I just have a final one that just came through the wire, and if we can answer it in a few sentences, that would be great. Do either of you know if there's any funding out there for historical cemeteries that you know of or you've heard of? Where should someone interested in that kind of work look?
I'm not aware of anything.
No, neither am I. There used to be some funding for cemeteries in years gone by, but that was like maybe more than 10, 15 years ago, and I don't think there's anything out there right now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that clarification. Could be some creative funding needed on those sorts of projects. Thank you so much, Angelina and Kate, for joining us for a Q&A. I'm sorry we don't have more time to talk, but to all those of you listening today in our webinar, please, get in touch with Kate and Angelina or any of the folks you've spoken to today. If you have further questions, you're welcome to talk to anyone here at the Ontario Historical Society, and I know Kathy has made herself available at the MHSO to answer questions. So I'm just going to wrap up now. Thank Thank you, Angelina and Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick look to the future on our next webinar, which is a very exciting one. It will cover starting up educational programs at a museum or heritage site, and that's going to be in late May 2014. So if your organization or institution wants to develop school tours, family programs, and on-site activities, and you're starting at square one, this webinar is for you. Even if you want to brush up on policies and best practices, this could be a great tool and resource. So we'll go through the process of developing educational programs both from the policy and practical sides of planning. Watching this webinar today, you've participated in the Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project. In addition to webinars, the Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network will bring about a lot of new and exciting online features for our members, including our new members-only blog, The Well, where you can read breaking Ontario history news, read about great heritage work being done across the province, and have discussions with other members. And this blog will be launched with our new website in the next month or so. We're also developing a digital map tool showing all the heritage organizations from our heritage directory across the province, allowing you to easily find other heritage groups and sites in your area. So we recognize that having resources and tools at your fingertips online is key to supporting our members. So if you're interested in becoming a member, email Christina Perfetto, our membership coordinator, at members@ontariohistoricalsociety.ca, or check out our website, ontariohistoricalsociety.ca. Thank you so much to our speakers, Angelina French, Ryan Frigo, Kathy Leakham, and Kate Oxley. Thank you everyone to attending. I'm Allison Little, and feel free to get in touch with everyone listed here for clarification and updates on what we talked about today. And best of luck on your applications to Grants Ontario. Thank you, everyone.